Rockaways Productions presents The Casey Waters Show, episode 470, Growth and Support in Relationship Dynamics. Hello, I'm your host, Casey Waters. Today, I will continue with Define the Word Demagogue. Here, I look at how politicians stir up fear to further their agenda. Then, it's on to growth and support in relationship dynamics. Here, I look at how important it is to support one another in relationships and encourage learning and growth, and how that could lead to better mental health and relationships, both in the family and on the job. Today's show will feature background footage from Strawberry Gap Trail. Strawberry Gap Trail is located between Fairview and Girton, North Carolina. To get there from Asheville, North Carolina, take Highway 74A East. Go through Fairview. When you cross the Henderson County line at Hickory Nut Gap, well, just a little past that, you take a right into a parking lot. And here the trail starts. First it goes up to Ferguson's Peak. And then it goes beyond that. And eventually to Blue Ridge Meadows. Some high pastures that have great views. So, now let's continue with Define the Word Demagogue. But often, well, if the teacher sees the victor in a virtuous light, perhaps it will be colored even more, and not just told the way the victor wrote it, but perhaps with even more of a slant in the victor's favor. As I said, sometimes the opposite might happen, especially if we see the victor as someone evil. We might look at that version of history he or she wrote down with a more critical eye, perhaps do some research, find some alternative sources for the event, and perhaps be able to tell a more accurate version of what happened. So history, well, it's distorted. But perhaps we're going from bad to worse, out of the frying pan into the fire, as even more of our history might not be taught. Sure, there's critical race theory. Well, I like to call it American history taught in a more accurate way. I guess even back in the 70s, history was somewhat whitewashed. Told in a version where the white person looks more virtuous and perhaps, not so mean and cruel to minorities. But in fact, we are mean and cruel to minorities. Probably more so than I realize, because the history I taught was whitewashed. So we got to get a grip and teach things the way they happened. For example, one of my friends, who's a little older than me, he was born in 54 instead of 61 like I was. He also grew up in a poor neighborhood and was much more in tune to minority communities than I was. And so I'm like, the civil rights movements, yeah, it started from Rosa Parks wanting a better seat on the bus, and some students in Greensboro wanting to sit at the lunch counter. But of course, it was much more than that. But what's often not told, at least I wasn't taught this, was the story of poor Emmett Till, a black man from out of town. I think he was from Chicago. He was visiting Mississippi. Well, he happened to flirt, perhaps more like talk to, but I wasn't there. They accused him of flirting with a white shopkeeper. And the penalty for this is death. Well, in the most brutal way thinkable. Sure, he was brutalized, beaten beyond belief. Apparently, there's photos. I haven't seen them. Apparently, it's been made into a movie. I dare you to watch it. I'm sure it's quite intense. I never seen it yet. Well, gee. Of course, the final stage of his life, after being totally beaten, he had a large, heavy metal fan, an industrial fan strapped to him. And then he was dumped into a river to just sink and die. Perhaps his murderer said something about, now it's time to meet your maker. Perhaps he said something about poor Emmett Till having to go before God to confess his sins of flirting with a white shopkeeper, being a black man. But of course, the murderers themselves, one day, I guess, many years later, perhaps met their maker too. Sure, and perhaps that maker might not have been too pleased with their act of justice. Judge not, lest ye be judged. Let's remember this. You who are in Christian schools, you who teach Christian schools. For let's get to the word. Define the word demagogue. Now, most vocabulary is covered between 5th and 10th grade, let's say. So I'm hoping during that time period you are taught demagogue. Demagogue. Look it up. Yeah, so as I said, hopefully it's in your vocabulary. I think it was with me. Lucky me. Demagogue. Well, it's a fearmonger of sorts. It's a politician who uses emotion and racism to stir up the base, to appeal to his followers or her followers, and perhaps to set the tone for an agenda, to get the people to accept an agenda which they might not otherwise, because of this problem of racism or some other fear of crime. The politician appeals to the emotions of the voters. Fear of inflation, fear of losing our culture, fear of minorities, fear of immigrants, fear of crime. These people and situations are described, but they're colored. They're distorted to make it look worse than it really is. Perhaps crime rates in minority communities might be greatly exaggerated. to justify treating them unfairly. There's many ways demagogues stir up hate, stir up fear, and stir up prejudice. So just remember that's what demagogues do. Stir up fear, prejudice, and hatred. They tell the story from one side without telling the story from the other side. And even if they say everything they say is actually true, you still don't get the perspective from the other side, the losing side. So, remember the word demagogue. Demagogue. The politician who stirs up fear and prejudice and hatred, who only tells one side of the story. Well, typically the white side of the story. And white is right, so they would probably say, and emphasize how important, well, the culture of white America is. Instead of emphasizing that our country was founded as a country of immigrants and how our country is supposed to be a melting pot. Well, let it be a melting pot. And if white people become a minority, oh well. We have to look beyond that. For what typically happens is when we have this demagoguery, this fear, this racism and prejudice that's stirred up, well, often it's so we won't feel bad about marginalizing a minority community. We won't feel bad about taking the rights away from minorities or reducing their influence or power because they're not virtuous and we look down on them. So it's okay if they have a little less power and don't have all the rights we have and make less money than we do. But then it comes back to us. And, well, the dominant community, the white community, starts to suffer too. Their rights starts getting eroded as well. Perhaps not as fast as the minority community. And their influence is reduced. And yes, their pay is reduced too. But apparently research has shown that white people would rather make less money as long as minorities were making less than them. To give an example, perhaps a white person will feel comfortable earning $10 an hour as long as their minority coworkers earn only $9 an hour or even less. Perhaps they would, if everybody earned $11 an hour, let's say, they would say that's unfair and they would rather earn $10 an hour and have their coworkers who are minorities and perhaps even women earn less. Yeah, misogynist. That's another good word to look up. The hater of women. Sure. Is that in your vocabulary too? I'm kind of curious. 4. A lot of things might be left out in teaching our children. But anyway, so these politicians, they'll erode our rights. See, it's conquer and divide is what it is. They get us fighting each other. They get us focused on each other, white versus minorities, for example, men versus women. And they'll kind of keep us down on the farm, so to speak. They'll keep us under control with less influence, less rights, and less money. However, if we somehow banded together, minorities, women, and white people, if we all formed together as a team and realize working together is much more effective than fighting each other, and we all demanded rights, equal rights for minorities, women, and white men. What's that called? The Equal Rights Amendment? Ooh, when was it proposed? Ooh, maybe 50 years ago. Wasn't it passed? No, it never was. And I'm not sure about this, but there still might not be a federal anti-lynching law on the books yet. I'm not sure, but there might not be yet. But there's certainly no equal rights amendment to protect women against being paid less than men. Last I heard, I think women made 83 cents on the dollar to men. Something like that. Maybe 82 cents. Maybe they made a little progress since 1973. Maybe back then it was 75 cents to the dollar or something like that. They made a little progress, but not near enough. And that's the way it is with a lot of issues. With women, with minorities. Yeah, they might have more rights, but not near as much as they should have. And in fact, a lot of the rights are being eroded back. Well, the Voting Rights Act has been gutted by Republicans. Well, because they want less black people and minorities to vote. So by gutting the Voting Rights Act, which was created to ensure that minorities can vote, well, now they're getting rid of it so to make it easier to make it harder for minorities to vote. Republicans want less minorities to vote. They're so good at it here in North Carolina that they gerrymandered our congressional districts almost with surgical precision, as described by a judge who ruled that they were too gerrymandered. But now the North Carolina State Supreme Court ruled that they can gerrymander them anyway. So at least I think that's the last that happened. So we're still stuck with gerrymandered districts. And, well, we just have to deal with it. And everybody needs to vote. But as I said, our rights are being taken away by the demagogues out there who stir up fear and hatred and prejudice and racism to conquer and divide us, to strip away the rights of minority and women, and eventually strip away all our rights. Where, as I said, we need to band together and work for each other and support each other. Men supporting women and supporting minorities, sure. Well, I guess we need to start going to the school board meetings and make sure that demagogue is still in the vocabulary list. Well, I hope you have enjoyed this section of The Casey Waters Show. Now it is time for growth and support in relationship dynamics. Well, as you could hear, we got the cockatiels in the background. They're nearby, although covered up. I'm trying to silence them, trick them into thinking it's night, but it's really day. It's in the middle of the afternoon, my favorite time to film. Anyway, so growth and support in relationship dynamics. So, what am I talking about? Well, I'm basically talking about how we get along and how we could get along better or worse, depending on how we approach things, how we relate to one another, what we prioritize in our discussions, and other things. So let's dive into it. So we have our relationships, and of course we have many of them. Family, friends, our partners, or husband and wife, or whatever it might be, and our jobs. Well, and I guess our classroom situations too, if we're still in school. So we want to have good relationships. How do we do that? It could be a little tricky at times because sometimes people annoy us and we express ourselves. We let them know how annoyed we are, how they messed up, and how they might do things right in the future. Even though this might seem to be the logical approach to solve a problem, often it deteriorates the relationship. So it's kind of tricky. I guess even a little complicated. So you just have to work on these relationship skills. And I guess one of them is not saying the obvious, saying what the major malfunction is, and telling the person how to correct themselves. What typically happens is whoever you're trying to correct will explain how they did it their way for whatever reasons, because that's the way they do it, or they forgot what you told them, or, other things. They think differently than you do, and often this will create a conflict even further as they try to justify their mistake. And you try to correct their mistake and tell them how to do it right. And then they say how their way might be the right way, or how their way is the obvious or normal way for them, or something like that. And of course, you could get in other arguments about other things. And it all kind of blows up, and then our relationship goes downhill. Well, if it's on the job, just could affect whether we get promoted or not. If it's with an intimate partner of us, if it's with an intimate partner, well, then the relationship could suffer for years to come. Or maybe even end. So instead of being critical, we have to approach things from a totally different angle. Yeah, it's a little tricky and complicated. And it probably takes longer to do it. And so I guess what I'm saying here is try to relate to these critical people, especially after they make mistakes. Try to do it when you have a little extra time, when you're not in such a hurry. Typically, I am in such a hurry. I'm just busy, it seems. And so it's a little tough for me. But anyway, you gotta take the time. The time for what? Well, to create a positive feedback loop of support, learning, and encouragement. Well, it all sounds fine and dandy. Well, how do you do that? Well, you have to, start things on a positive note. And so, instead of criticizing someone for their error, perhaps part of the task or part of the situation or whatever they did right. So start by telling him or her what a good job they did on at least part of it, the part they got right. Then, you might talk about other positive characteristics they have that might be useful in related situations. Sure. And then, when you continue on with that, and of course, this all has to be sincere and logical. So stick to practical things that have a bearing on your relationship, whether it's at work or family or whatever. But create a positive situation. Tell him or her they're doing good. And give them some reasons why. Describe things. Listen to what they're saying. And employ active listening. That is, repeat back what they say. Paraphrase it. Or at least summarize the key points. To prove to them that you really are listening. And that you do understand. Then move on to your point.
Casey Waters Show. Producer, Casey Waters. Graphic editing, Judson Laird. Please note our new email address, caseywaters2@caseywaters.com.